Thank you, Thomas. Good timing. Have to wait for the recording notification to start. Yeah, thank you, everyone. We have a really cool program today. Good to see some familiar faces or see some familiar names at the start. Been a while since I've been to one of these. To kick things off, I'm hoping participants, if you could just, or everyone rather, put in the chat the organization you're with and where you're signing in from. It's just good to see, you know, the diaspora of where we have folks signing in from. And as Thomas alluded to, we are talking about the NEVI infrastructure package funding that has come out. So that came out of the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, which is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and that was signed into law in November of 2021. The program allocates $5 billion over the next 5 years to all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. And in the past year, there's been plans submitted by all of the states, which now all of those plans have been formally approved by the federal government. And we have some experts here that were involved in that process for their respective states, of all 4 states that the Bonneville Environment Foundation touches. So to kick things off, we will have a kind of overview from a policy manager at Forth, Stu Green. And then we have Kyla Mackey, who is the energy resource professional with Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Emily Herr will follow that, with a senior policy analyst in Idaho's Governor's Office of Energy and Mineral Resources. Tonya Buell, of Alternative Fuels Program Manager at Washington State Department of Transportation. And closing out will be Mary Brazel, Transportation Electrification Program Manager with the Oregon Department of Transportation. And then after that, we will have some time at the end, about 30 minutes, to ask questions to our panelists, but also have some communications with each other, ask other utilities questions, as we like to stoke that conversation as well during these quarterly meetings. So right before we get started, I want to do a quick plug that Forth Roadmap Conference, our Portland held conference focused on transportation electrification, will be held in May of 2022. And there are requests for proposals if you have an interesting project or that you would potentially like to talk about. And you can also buy some tickets and prepare for that. So a really great conference to get some information on transportation electrification, and it's local to the Northwest. So last thing before we get to our speakers is a quick poll that we made just to get an idea of where folks are related to our conversation. So Ashley, if you could go ahead and launch that, would be great. And I think, Ashley, after a minute, you can choose to reveal those results. All right, thank you for the folks that responded. Kind of a mix here. Cool to see that about 1/10 of us are feeling really prepared and ready, but for the rest of us, there's some work to do. So hopefully some of the experts here can provide some resources and guidance on that, and use this utility working group to communicate with each other and help prepare. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Stu to provide an overview.
Okay, super. Thanks, Connor. So I know everybody here in the room probably has a sense already of NEVI a bit, but I will give you a brief overview of some key things in there, and also some things to look out for when we look at some of the state plans coming up here. I suppose I should say I'm Stu Green, policy manager here at Fourth. I've got experience working in a number of different state and utility level positions around the Northwest. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of stuff in the IIJA. And if you are curious about something that we don't touch on today, please reach out and we'll try to find you whatever answers we can. But I think, from a big pictures perspective, it's worth noting NEVI really is focused on charging infrastructure. We've got $5 billion for NEVI, which is huge. I also put here on this slide, I think everybody can follow along, but in case you want to look up additional information, I put in light gray there the actual section of the IIJA that the money is listed in. So NEVI is Division J. The other thing that I think is super worth keeping an eye on is this community infrastructure grant. I think we are all waiting very much for the guidance to come out on this community grant program. And it's been almost a year, November 15th last year, that we passed IIJA. And I believe they have a year to stand up the program. So we should be seeing more on that pretty soon. Also of interest, because we have utility folks in the room here, electric buses. I think you may not have activities happening directly within the utility related to buses, but it's definitely worth reaching out to your districts, school districts or transit districts, and see if there's anything you can do there. As well with the Formula Carbon Reduction Program. We're waiting to see exactly how that's going to be unfurled in the Northwest, but these are both good programs in addition to NEVI and the infrastructure grant to keep an eye on. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Ashley. Just broadly, there's a couple of different things that we're trying to do with NEVI. Basically upgrade all the existing DC fast chargers that need it, install more fast chargers where we can. Funds for NEVI are going to cover operation and maintenance costs for at least 5 years. In addition, we should have funds to do a good amount of community engagement, stakeholder engagement, as well as developing our workforce. And making sure that people can find these chargers and have appropriate standards so that they have a good experience using them. So we're really looking, I think, with NEVI to up our game probably 4 or 5 notches with our national charging infrastructure. And every utility has a place in that, in my opinion. Let's see. Also, there's funding in here for mapping and analysis, different sorts of assessment that we need to do on the back end to make sure that these investments are working well. Let's take the next slide, Ashley, please. So broadly speaking, we're looking at putting at least 450 kilowatt chargers in every 50 miles across the country. That would be a wonderful place to start. Ideally, we're going to have common standards and make this a system that everybody can use. Hopefully, we have internalized a lot of the lessons learned from the last 10 years of DC fast charging infrastructure, where operability and reliability were key issues. I think NEVI is making an effort to really try to correct this and ensure that we have a system that works for people, and that's really going to be something we can depend on. Also, Justice 40 applies to this. So we really want to push benefits to this into communities that are going to need additional effort to achieve environmental justice outcomes. Hopefully, we'll see that fully manifested in all 50 state plans once they're starting to be implemented. Also, they're making an effort at the Joint Office to really ensure that states are getting stakeholder engagement. And of course, everything's going to have to be federally approved through the Joint Office. So my hope is that there will be a level of consistency once we get through all of these plans and actually have a system that works across the country. Let's do the next slide. So I think it's exciting to see now that we have all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and DC finally approved. Devil's in the details, of course, and I think we're going to learn a lot of interesting things from our Pacific Northwest plans here today. I, for one, have not read all 50 plans, and I hope none of you have either. But no doubt we will be seeing some really interesting variations in state to state and region to region. I think one thing I didn't put on here, which maybe is worth calling out, the community grant program. We don't have
Hey, what do you think you're doing, dog?
Oh, pardon, Carl, I think, oh, never mind.
Sorry.
That's okay. um, so we're waiting on guidance for the community grant program, and hopefully we'll have that real soon and be able to use that in a sense to complement all the NEVI plans that are being laid. Let's go to the next slide. So I know that this does not represent all of the funding that's being invested in fast charging and other forms of charging through the Northwest, but just purely on NEVI numbers, this is how much we've been awarded here and what we have to work with. Pretty decent place to start, I think, but I'm sure all of us would agree that there's much more funding needed and planning needed in order to really make a system that's going to serve us for the next 10, 20, 30 years. But for a place to start, I think everybody is feeling really good about both the IIJA and the IRA funding that is coming down. And hopefully we'll be able to really put this to good use. I know in the Northwest, we've had a lot of experience in the past that's going to be guiding our decisions in the next few years here. So I think with that, I'm going to probably pull back and hand it on to, I think Kyla is next. But just very broad picture, there's more funding coming down the line than we've ever really seen before. In IIJA, there's nearly $50 billion all told that's worth looking at both for clean grid and for EV use. So I won't go down that rabbit hole in this moment, but I think this is a great moment of opportunity, and I love the opportunity to hear what our other states are going to do.
Great. Well, I think I'm going next. So thanks, Stuart. And that's a good background. My name is Kyla Mackey. I am an energy resource professional at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. And I will share my screen here. Just have a few slides to talk about Montana's electric vehicle infrastructure deployment plan for the NEVI program. And can everybody see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So just a little bit of context introduction to Montana's plan. So the Montana Energy Office at DEQ worked very closely with our Department of Transportation and their planning department to put together our EV infrastructure deployment plan and conduct stakeholder outreach ahead of releasing a draft plan, which was then open for comment. And then we submitted our final plan to the joint office. And again, worked really closely and coordinated with our Department of Transportation on developing the plan, and also plan to work closely across both agencies on implementation of the plan. So Montana, as Stuart noted, is going to be receiving $43 million over 5 years for of the NEVI funds to build out EV infrastructure in the state. We anticipate, based on the allocations that were announced, that in the first year we'll have a little over $6 million for projects, and then the subsequent 4 years we'll have a little over $9 million for projects. So that's kind of the background and context of Montana's plan. Also, as far as some context goes, in terms of where we're at with electric vehicle registrations and charging station deployment in the state, We're, as you would imagine, being a rural state with relatively low population, large geographic area, we have relatively low numbers of EVs currently registered in the state. And this is data from January 2022 that we collect from our motor vehicle division, vehicle registration department. And at that point, it was just under 2,000 all electric vehicles registered in the state. We do anticipate that when we collect this on an annual basis, that this next year, that number is likely to be about double. That's what we've been seeing the last 3 years that we've been collecting data, is that the numbers have doubled year over year. So, maybe closer to 4,000 vehicles by early this coming year. This map shows the current charging stations in the state. You'll see that this also includes level 2 stations. I realize this program and the topic of conversation with NEVI is fast charging stations, but this map just demonstrates both level 2 stations and the DC fast charging stations, which are in orange, that are currently, their projects currently operating in Montana. You can see most of them are concentrated in the western portion of the state. There's not much east of Billings and Bozeman, so very few stations currently deployed. So there's 9 total public fast charging stations. This, of course, does not include Tesla, which is still a proprietary network, so not available to other vehicles. And then we also have some planned stations in the works for fast charging stations. This is outside of NEVI. This is mostly funding that and projects that we've funded through our Volkswagen settlement dollars that the Energy Office does administer those. We anticipate about 9 projects coming in the next year or so through that program. And then just also some anticipated numbers of electric vehicle drivers traveling in Montana. I mentioned the EV registrations. We had some analysis done, commissioned a study on what we expect for the EV drivers in Montana by 2030. And this isn't just in-state residents, of course. We get a lot of vehicles traveling from out of state. Tourism is an important part of Montana's economy. And so based on registration numbers from surrounding states like Washington and Oregon and California, we anticipate that the total number of EV drivers under kind of a medium, a little bit more conservative scenario is about 130,000 EV drivers traveling annually across the state. And the vast majority of those, about 100,000, are coming from out of state, but it's important to consider those out of state drivers. And that's one of the key focus of Montana's deployment plan, is supporting EV tourism and traffic from those coming from neighboring states. And then this is just that map a little bit bigger if it was hard to see from that last slide. So this again just shows the charging stations, and then it shows level 2 stations in green, and then the fast charging stations in orange. The fast charging stations are primarily funded with our Volkswagen funding. We do have 3 currently operating Electrify America stations in Dell and Butte along I-15, and then Missoula on I-90. So it does include 3 of the Electrify America stations. So this is from that study that DEQ commissioned that looked at the market for EVs and anticipated drivers. It also analyzed, based on the current station, EV charging stations, the fast charging stations, and the planned stations, what's the distance between those stations along our key alternative fuel corridors. And I should note that, of course, the NEVI funds are going towards alternative fuel corridors. Montana has designated all of the interstates, so I-90, I-15, and I-94 in the eastern part of the state as alternative fuel corridors. In addition, we've designated US 93, so the far west portion of the state going north and south, and US Highway 2 running across the state close to the Montana-Canadian border as alternative fuel corridors. So that's where we're prioritizing the funding. So just wanted to note that on this slide, as well as what we're working with for current distances between charging stations and so between the existing and then the planned stations that we know of, and what those gaps are currently, and how many of those gaps meet the NEVI requirements. So you can see if it's sort of in that light blue, purple kind of color, those distances do meet the current alternative fuel corridor requirements of 50 miles or less. But if it's in orange, it does not meet it. So you can see the majority of the distances between stations, especially as you get further east across the state, do not meet those 50-mile requirements. So for our state plan and strategies to address these gaps that we see with the fast charging in Montana, which there are a lot, there's a lot of need there. We, of course, want to meet the requirements of NEVI and the goals of NEVI to, support the convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable national EV charging network. But some of the state-specific goals that take into account our state-specific issues. These are some of the goals that we laid out in the plan and some of our priorities. So number one is that we anticipate that third parties will own and operate the charging stations. So not the state. The state does not anticipate owning and operating these charging stations. Private entities, in some cases, maybe local governments, municipalities would provide the non-federal matching funds. So the 20%, it's an 80-20% split on the funding for these projects. The state will issue competitive solicitations to entities to install, operate, and maintain the EV charging stations. We are prioritizing the public funding for underserved and rural areas of the state, complying again with the Justice 40, but also looking very closely at rural locations for those public dollars. And then in addressing the gaps, we really want to fill our 100-mile gaps along the designated corridors first, and then come back in the later years of the program to address the 50-mile gaps. And then additionally, some additional priorities are focusing on locations that are hubs and gateway communities in the state. So gateways to our national parks and other recreation areas. Hubs are defined as locations that are at the intersection of two designated corridors or two important travel corridors in the state. Also, we'll continue to assess, nominating additional corridors potentially in future years that would be eligible for NEVI funds. $43 million, it's, a good amount of money, but with Montana's geography, we will more than likely spend that money out on our current designated corridors, but we will we'll continue to monitor whether it makes sense to nominate additional corridors. And then finally, just continuing to monitor investments along corridors by the private charging networks like Electrify America, monitoring whether Tesla opens up their locations, their supercharger network locations to non-Tesla drivers. That's something that they've announced, but the timing is uncertain on that. So we'll just continue to monitor those developments as we prioritize where our funds are going each year and update our plan and our solicitations accordingly. And then just a snapshot, a glimpse into our first year funding priorities. So we identified, focusing on the interstates, on those gaps along the interstates, the current gaps that exist between charging stations. So, we're looking at 10 up to maybe 13 locations for the first year funding. We're anticipating using both the FY22, the little over $6 million, and then the FY23 funds should also be available. And so we'll probably roll those into one solicitation. So we may be able to do more than 10 locations. This map identifies 10 priority locations in gray along the interstates. The green locations just are showing the existing fast charging stations. So we have 10 locations along the interstates. I will note that, based on what we understand, I mean, this is a very dynamic process, but based on what we understand, there's already a couple of locations along I-94, Miles City and Glendive that we understand that Electrify America will likely be coming and putting in stations there. And so we may move some of those priority locations depending on the progress with Electrify America. So subject to change, we're still developing our RFP, waiting for final guidance, as I imagine the other states are on the NEVI program or from excuse me, FHWA for the program. And so that's where this is not set in stone for our initial locations, but that's where what we identified in our plan. And I think that's my last slide, but I'll just note that we, of course, other things we addressed in our plan were the labor and workforce issues, how to address Justice 40 compliance, and sorry, utility and grid considerations. Those are all addressed in our plan, and I can drop a link to our plan here in the chat if folks want to take a look at that, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kyla. Yeah, if you have some questions, please think about those and we'll get to them after our last three speakers. But for now, I will pass it over to Emily to speak to Idaho.
Thanks, Connor. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Herr. I'm a senior policy analyst within the Idaho Office of Energy and Mineral Resources, and I am going to be going over Idaho's NEVI formula program plan that we just got approved. So just for some context, Idaho will receive just under $30 million throughout fiscal year 22 through 26. So what that looks like this year is we'll be receiving a little bit over $4 million. And then for subsequent years, we'll be receiving just over $6 million. Ready to move on to the next slide. The state of Idaho's vision is to effectively deploy universal and publicly available EV charging infrastructure along Idaho's major travel corridors at intervals that provide drivers the confidence to travel throughout the state while meeting community and economic needs. So if we move on to the next slide, Idaho outlines 7 goals that inform our vision. The first goal is enhanced transportation experience. So with the NEVI guidance released, we're looking at installing EV charging stations every 50 miles along our major travel corridors. And to the best of our ability and where feasible, Idaho will try to achieve that goal. Our second goal is to improve clean transportation access. So in 2021, over 40% of EV registrations were in Ada County, which is one of Idaho's most populous and wealthy counties. It's where our major urban center is, Boise. So our goal is to really increase adoption in all corners of the state. Just as of July 2022, we had over 4,500 EV registrations. And from 2020 to 2022, the increase was over 140%. So we're definitely seeing EV adoption start to increase. Our third goal is connection and enhancement throughout the region. And we definitely coordinate with our neighbors through different regional groups such as Charge West, Rev West. We're working with Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Alaska, Hawaii, through new groups formed, new groups that AASHTO, NASIO, and the Joint Office have formed. Number 4, improving air quality and decreasing the energy burden and environmental exposure. So Idaho's transportation sector makes up 58% of CO2 emissions. So goal number 4 is definitely something that we're aiming for. And then other goals include increasing access to low-cost capital, increasing the clean energy job pipeline, and increase involvement in energy issues and decision-making, which is a great segue into my next slide. So with our NEVI plan, we brought on a consultant to help us do outreach. And so we had a pretty extensive stakeholder engagement process throughout the summer. And a big focus of our outreach was on equity and making sure that we're engaging with rural, underserved, and disadvantaged communities. So our outreach, it looked like we had 6 public meetings in different regions of the state. We also had a virtual public meeting. We also had numerous one-on-one stakeholder meetings with different groups and organizations, including the Idaho Hispanic Council, the Idaho Indian Affairs Committee, and throughout our various stakeholder engagement, we collected over 1,300 pieces of feedback. Also, another tool for stakeholder engagement that we had was a survey, which we also had a Spanish language version available to the public. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide is showing Idaho's alternative fuel corridors where we're prioritizing EV infrastructure build out. So our current alternative fuel corridors include I-15, I-84, I-86, I-90, State Highway 1, US 93, US 95, US 12, US 20, and US 30. Through our survey, we collected some feedback on which travel corridors the public would like to see us install EV charging on. And so, as you can see, I-84 was an interstate that we received a lot of feedback on, as long as we received a lot of feedback from the public on making sure that we're electrifying north-south corridors as well. So US 95 was also a corridor of interest to the public. And something interesting to note in Idaho, so there's a federal emphasis on interstates and the national highway system with this NEVI formula program. And so they really want to see us build out this national network. But in Idaho, we have a lot of state highways that operate like interstates and are very popular travel corridors. And so, for instance, we nominated State Highway 75, which goes through the middle of our state and provides access to a very popular recreational and tourist area, Sun Valley, Blaine County, Ketchum. And so we nominated that for alternative fuel corridor designation, and the Federal Highway Administration actually denied that request. So that's something that we're going to continue to advocate for, is for the Federal Highway Administration to also value our state highways, and so that we can put some NEVI funding towards those areas. So through our survey, we collected some feedback on some location suggestions. And so many people from the public were concerned about, like I just mentioned, electrifying our state highways, making sure that we're providing access to tourist destinations and also to our more rural areas. All right, moving on to the next slide. So our plan, our 2022 plan outlines that the state of Idaho for this first year of funding will focus on conducting a siting access and feasibility study, whereas some other states have already completed these kind of studies. Idaho, we're looking to do that this year. And so we want to be really strategic with where we're installing these stations. So with this study, that bulleted list are just some topics that we're hoping to include in our study, but we're not limited to these topics. So this includes transportation facility access, electrical service provision, access and cost, equity, public health benefits, near and long-term EV charging corridors that support national freight and goods movement, and service to public lands such as national parks and other federal land management agency units. And in our plan, we outline a phased approach of how we're going to deploy this EV charging infrastructure. So phase one, we just completed, that was drafting our first plan and then outlining some of the minimum criteria and guidance for the development of our siting access and feasibility study. Right now, we're in phase two. So we're in the phase where we're going to start our siting access and feasibility study. So this goes on now until August of 2023. We're also hoping within the next year to not install any stations, but to do pilot solicitations and have contracts signed to be able to start installing stations as soon as 2023. And so right now we're in the process of developing an RFP to bring on a consultant to help us do this study. And then phase three will be the creation of a multi-year action plan and actually beginning to install these NEVI stations. So similar to what Kyla mentioned of what's happening in Montana with these different agencies working together, I work for the Governor's Office of Energy and Mineral Resources. We've really strengthened our working relationship with the Idaho Transportation Department and also our Department of Environmental Quality. And so our agencies are working on developing an MOU to define roles and clarify roles around EV infrastructure in the NEVI program specifically. And let's see, we'll move on to the next slide. The DEQ and OEMR have already been working very closely on EV charging infrastructure deployment through our State of Idaho Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment Program. We jointly administered this program, and this program was $2.6 million through the Volkswagen settlement to install fast chargers on Idaho's major travel corridors. And so the application is now closed, but the program ran from 2017 until 2022. This summer is when we closed the application. In total, we were able to fund 12 projects across the state. And we have a lot of lessons learned from this program that we can apply to the NEVI program. First of all, long-term operations and maintenance of these stations. With the EVSE program, we've seen that some applicants were not fully aware of, for instance, demand charges and other things that they have to deal with when they're operating these stations. Also, we learned a lot about different supply chain issues and how that can affect the ability to install these stations in a timely manner. Other lessons learned. So through our EVSE program, we provided 80% cost share to private site hosts and then 100% cost share to government-owned site hosts. And we realized that these DC fast chargers are a pretty substantial investment, especially for our small mom and pop shops that are interested in installing fast chargers. So as Kyla mentioned, there's an 80-20 split for the NEVI program. So that 20% match could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's an important thing to consider. And then another lesson learned is just the value of cross-agency partnership. So this program, as I mentioned, began in 2017, and we really didn't see applications pick up until the past couple years. And I think that's really because we started to get the word out more about this program by working with our Commerce Department. Our Commerce Department has these professionals called economic development professionals in different regions of the state. And so we started working with them to get the word out about these EV charging grant programs. And then that really sparked a lot of interest in EV charging in a lot of our more rural parts of the state. Moving on to the next slide. This is just a table of some projects that we funded. So this is only 5 of the 12 projects. But as you can see, we've had just a variety of different folks apply to it. So we've awarded grants to tribes, counties, cities, rural electric co-ops, also just some private site hosts like convenience store owners. So yeah, that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions after our other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for speaking to your NEVI projects. And we'll move on to Tonya to speak to Washington's plans.
Excellent. Hello, I'm here. So Ashley, it looks like something happened in the transition over to what I sent, but hopefully it's just some page numbering and things that are gone. Anyway, I want to first off say thank you to Fourth and to BEF for hosting this webinar today. And inviting me to speak. I think this is a great opportunity for utilities to get ready for what's coming, are a critical part of the success of the national EV infrastructure rollout and deployment of other EV charging programs. So thank you for your interest. This is a very exciting time for all of us. This is, I think we've reached the tipping point. We're moving forward, and at least in Washington, this is the most funding we've ever had for highway corridor charging. So we are just thrilled to be working on this. I will be giving you an overview. My name is Tonya Buell, and I'm with the Washington State Department of Transportation Innovative Partnerships Office, and I've been working on EV charging for many years and can definitely just feel the space exploding right now. So it's very exciting, very dramatic and dynamic and exciting. And so I'm glad to be here. I'm also joined by a couple of folks from our Department of Commerce Energy Office from the Clean Transportation Program. So they might even be available for questions after. So next slide, please. Let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to start my time now. Hold on one second. All right, so I'm going to highlight 5 things today. 1 is our state-funded highway corridor charging program. 2 is our new EV Coordinating Council. 3 is an overview of our state plan for NEVI. And then our number 4 is a new mapping and forecasting tool that we're developing. And then number 5 is some upcoming funding opportunities. So let's go ahead and get started with the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Partnerships, also known as ZVIP, is a state grant program that we've been working on ever since we started working with Oregon DOT on the West Coast Electric Highway and opened those stations in 2012. We've been looking for state funding to expand charging to other roadways. And so we've finally built up a really strong state program. Just funded our last round at $10 million for EV charging projects along highway corridors. And we do that through an open, competitive process. It's really about DC fast charging and also hydrogen fuel cell refueling. And through this program, we offered the opportunity to upgrade existing stations or put in new stations or add stations. We are very focused on the corridor, just like the NEVI program, and all types of roadways, whether it's a state route or an alternative fuel corridor. We did this time know that NEVI was coming and saw the preliminary guidance, of course, anxiously awaiting the final rules and standards, but we use those same standards for electric vehicle charging every 50 miles within a mile of a highway interchange, and a minimum of 450 kilowatt DC fast charging with combo charging, system charging. And for the state program, only nonprofit organizations, tribes, and government agencies are eligible applicants who work with the private sector to get charging along our corridors. So we're in the process of getting charging infrastructure out there now, and there will be another opportunity in the spring of next year for future projects. Next slide, please. And so we actually got $10 million worth of requests, and we're only able to fund about 1/4 of that. But we're very excited. We are finally upgrading the legacy West Coast Electric highway chargers, which are CHAdeMO only now, but we'll soon have CCS, and also have opportunities for e-bikes and e-scooters and e-wheelchairs to charge up at those sites. We are reaching 24 communities with 12 that are upgraded and 12 new. And I'm very excited about it. You can learn more about it and get on our list, because if you are a public utility district, you can apply for these grants. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Washington State EV Council, and it sounds like Idaho has something very similar. I know Mary's been working with her EV WIG group as well. And Washington State DOT, our Department of Commerce, Energy Office, and Ecology have been working together for years informally. But last legislative session, our legislators directed us to set up a more formal process and include 10 state agencies. And there are several agencies that are involved in some part of electric vehicle charging or electric vehicles in some way with different grant programs. So the goal here is to have a statewide plan that we'll be developing during the next year, and also a one-stop shopping for people interested in pursuing funding opportunities, where they can find out about all of the activities instead of needing to go through each state agency. So we just got this up and running, and have held a couple of meetings. Right now we're forming and doing the administrative things, but we're going to be ramping up and working together on planning for our future. We are, so we're very excited about the State EV Coordinating Council, and more to come on that. The Coordinating Council is actually overseeing the NEVI program. Although the funding comes to WashDOT, we're working with our partners on the EV Council to implement NEVI. Next slide, please. So here are our corridors that are designated as national EV corridors. So we've got I-5 north-south, we've got I-90 that will connect to Idaho's I-90. And then we've got some routes down to our Tri-Cities, and then up along our US Highway 101 corridor. And right now, so you saw in the very first slides that Washington our portion of the NEVI funding is $71 million over 5 years. And that sounds like a lot, but we have a lot of roadways, and we have a lot of electric vehicles already. So outside of California, we are one of the top states for EV market share, and we have more than 100,000 electric vehicles already on our roads, and are anticipating many, many more in the coming years. And so Looking at our map, you can see some dots, and those are Electrify America stations that meet the NEVI requirements. So fortunately, we already have a good start on building out our national alt fuel corridors, but we have a long way to go as well. Similar to Montana and Idaho, we are planning to contract everything out, turnkey process. We do not plan to own and operate any of this equipment. And there's a link when you get these slides, there's a link that you can follow to all of our state plan page. You can see our actual plan. You can see some of the outreach that we've done with surveys and meetings, and our online suggest a charger location map and all kinds of things. A team of us worked really hard this summer to get our NEVI state plan submitted on time, get the approval of the EV Coordinating Council, and we're pleased that it's approved. And we're going to be finding out in the coming weeks what we can do to improve that. We're going to hear from Federal Highways and the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation on our strengths and what we can improve. So it's going to be a document that we'll be updating in the coming years. Next slide, please. Here are our goals. They're very similar to other states. We followed the joint office template when we developed our state plan. And we have a lot of focus on equity and innovation. For me, the top priority is that we have accessible, reliable charging available when people need it. I hope that all the states take the reliability very seriously, because that can make or break the success, because we want people to feel confident that they're going to find charging when they're out driving, and that it's going to be working properly and they can get the charge they need. So we expect to have 5 times as many electric vehicles on our roads in the next 5 years. And we are working towards our goal of no new gas cars registered in our state. Our goal is 2030 and the mandate is 2035. So we have a big challenge ahead, but very exciting. Next slide, please. And these are some of the things that we're looking at. You can see this map overlay has our health disparities map, and we're taking the Justice 40 very seriously, and it will be a big part of our decisions on implementation. Next slide. One of the ways that we are going to determine priority investments is through a new mapping and forecasting tool for zero emission vehicles. This tool will be broader than just highway corridor charging, but will help the state with strategic planning and forecasting. Next slide, please. And finally, the Department of Commerce, and I've mentioned a couple of folks are on the line from there, have some funding opportunities coming up, and they're looking for information from potential partners and interested parties on how to shape that program. The legislature provided funding and some basic guidelines, but they're working to develop a whole program. There's $69 million available for electric vehicle charging and another $25 million for incentives. So they've asked that we spread the word that they're looking for feedback on how to shape that program. Next slide. All right, let's see how I did. 11 minutes. Okay, not too bad. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions after Mary Brazel speaks, and I'm very excited that she is up next.
Awesome. Thank you, Tonya. Yeah, go ahead and take it away, Mary.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hold on one second. I gotta so I'm going to talk fast because we're already at 2 o'clock almost. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today and share Oregon's NEVI plans and our plans for our community EV charging rebate. We are going to need to work closely with utilities to ensure the success of this program. So I'm especially pleased to be talking with you today. And as you heard, my name is Mary Brazel, and I'm the Transportation Electrification Program Manager in the Climate Office at the Oregon Department of Transportation. Next slide. So ODOT, that's what we call the Oregon Department of Transportation, recognizes the need to make substantial investments in transportation electrification charging infrastructure to help reduce pollution and combat climate change. And we have in our statewide transportation strategy identified that 50% of the targeted reductions in the greenhouse gases by 2050 must come from vehicles and fuels, and hence our support for electric transportation. And last year, ODOT conducted a statewide transportation electrification infrastructure needs analysis, which we call TINA for short. TINA identified the charging infrastructure needs to meet light-duty zero-emission vehicles, as well as medium and heavy-duty ZEVs like local delivery vehicles, long-haul trucks, school buses, transit buses, as well as electric micromobility. And a couple of the key findings for this are we noted that we have significant urban and rural charging deserts and a need for a 5-fold increase in charging infrastructure in just the next few years. So the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Oregon Transportation Commission, our governing body, identified over $100 million in dedicated funding for charging infrastructure over the next 5 years. The funding will come from a mix of federal and state sources. The National EV Infrastructure Program will make up about 2/3 of that. It's 65 million. That's the 52 million that we get from the federal government, plus the non-federal match, which we are assuming is going to be coming from the private sector. And we will be investing that in fast charging along Oregon's 11 electric alternative fuel corridors to meet mostly the needs of light-duty cars and trucks. But the remaining third, about 35 million, will close EV infrastructure gaps in areas not well supported by NEVI, such as within Oregon communities, especially in underserved communities and multi-unit dwellings like apartment buildings, and also to help build the charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure needed for medium and heavy duty ZEVs. So you want to go to the next slide? Our 5-year goals, our vision for the next few years is to create a backbone network of high-powered EV charging stations along major corridors in Oregon, similar to pretty much everyone else here, to increase Oregonians' confidence in EV charging. And we want to do as much good with this money as we can. So we're going to try and tailor it in lots of different ways. Our plan is to build out most of this backbone network in the first 3 years along our 11 alt fuel corridors. And I'll show you that map in a minute. And we'll reserve funding in the final 2 years to meet needs that become more apparent, either new corridors or adding redundancy, resiliency, upgrading existing stations, or needs that we aren't aware of yet. And we'll emphasize reliability and equity in all of our efforts. Next slide. Our deployment strategy is to rely heavily on public-private partnerships like Washington State. We've had experience over the last 10 years with the West Coast Electric Highway, and that is a public-private partnership. So the private sector will own, build, operate, and maintain stations. We're focused on a corridor approach to ensure broad coverage of all sites, whether they're attractive or not. And we'll procure contractors to develop stations along entire corridors through a competitive selection process. I'm going to skip over some of the things I was going to say and just go into saying we know that we're going to be needing to add new infrastructure and upgrading existing ones. Reliability, as Tonya mentioned and others have mentioned, is absolutely key. And we are going to require upfront maintenance plans and include targets, standards, potentially penalties and/or incentives to ensure that sites are reliable and available long-term. And at the end of this, we'll have a backbone network, charging network for Oregon. So let's look at that. Next slide. So here's what the network will look like once it's built out over the 5-year period. The green areas are the first year. So it's the southern part of I-5, Interstate 5, that runs north-south, connecting California and Washington. The northern part of I-5 already has enough Electrify America stations that meet the standards that we don't need to have add more stations there. We're also going to do Interstate 205, which is in the greater Portland area and serves a lot of disadvantaged communities, and another north-south route, US 97, through the middle of the state. The second year funding are the yellow lines, which are principally Interstate I-84 across the top by the Columbia River in Washington State, and US 20. Both of those head right into Idaho. The third year is US 101 on the coast, and US 26 that goes from the coast into Idaho and beyond. We're holding off until the third year for both of those because, again, Electrify America has indicated their intention to build some stations along there, and we want to just put in the backbone and spread out as many stations as we can with our funding. So we're going to wait and see where they put theirs in and then kind of fill in the gaps. And the last year, this year for the first time, when we proposed alternative fuel corridors, we proposed an Oregon State route, Oregon 42 in the southwest corner, and also US 95. So those both were approved, and we're thrilled about that. The rest of our alt fuel corridors are either interstates or US highways. So this is the first time we got a state road route approved, and we will be focusing on those in the latter part, and then, as I said before, reserving funding for any remaining funding for future build out yet to be determined. Next slide. So we're going to be meeting or exceeding minimum standards. We're all anxiously waiting for the Federal Highway Administration to define what the real bottom line minimum standards will be, but we're expecting that we are going to be trying to go a little bit beyond the 150 kilowatt charging requirement by building in as many places as possible what we're calling our quad pod that's got 3 150 kilowatt high powered chargers plus one even higher level charger, and future proofing for 2 additional high powered chargers. And in certain corridors where it makes sense, we're going to be trying to encourage pull through designs so that some of these higher powered charging stations will be enabling medium duty vehicles to charge up there as well. So, and for the utilities in the room, the future proofing will include at a minimum conduit and wiring for sites, but where feasible will include electrical upgrades. So next slide. Justice 40, just acknowledging again that ODOT, like all the other states, is required to deliver 40% of the benefits of this program to Justice 40 communities in our states, not just 40% of the chargers. So we're going to be holding regional workshops along routes to solicit community input on what and how benefits can best match community needs. Next slide. So public outreach to date, prior to our plan, which we submitted in July, ODOT undertook quite a bit of outreach to finalize that plan. And I'd like to point out that similar to what Tonya said in Washington, we have a NEVI web page with surveys and an interactive map so folks can share where they'd like to see EV charging infrastructure and raise their hands in case they're interested in being a site host. Next slide. Stakeholder outreach will continue over the next 5 years. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and we'll begin to conduct regional workshops along first-year corridors in the next 6 months. And it'll be very important for utilities to participate in these regional workshops and online open houses. So we look forward to initiating this outreach soon. Next slide. So the last thing I want to flag is ODOT's community EV charging rebate. We've committed about $4 million for the first round of this program. We're hoping to double that over time to support the installation of level 2 charging at locations across the state, such as stop and shop locations and tourist destinations, and also at multi-unit dwellings. The program's being designed as a first come, first served rebate with 70% of the funds reserved for disadvantaged and rural communities. And we expect that our rebate will cover approximately 75% of the costs to purchase and install level 2 EV charging equipment, between $3,500 and $4,500 per plug. And we are expecting these to be stackable with utility programs, but not exceed 100% of the costs. The program's not yet available, but expected to launch in the winter or spring of next year. And we will be working with a consultant team to do education outreach on this program and offer technical assistance. So stay tuned, stay involved, and thank you very much. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. Appreciate your presentation, and appreciations to everyone for your great slides and content. So at this point, I want to open it up to questions and comments from everyone attending. So feel free, if you're comfortable, you can turn on your camera, and you can use either the chat, the raised hand feature that Zoom has, or just go ahead and shout out some questions or some thoughts. I'll give a second for folks to share some things.
Herman, I have a question. What are we expecting in the way of changes or new guidance on the NEVI program from the federals?
Stu, you have any content there?
That's a good question. I think I checked the Joint Office website recently, and they did not have any updates except to say that funding would be released after plans are approved. Maybe states who have actually had plans submitted have heard differently. Mary, anybody want to chime in? Have you had communication from the Joint Office about fund approval?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was the notice of proposed rulemaking, which basically reopened absolutely every single thing in the NEVI state plan that they published in the February 10th guidance. So they reopened pretty much everything for comment. And we don't know when we're going to get, we've asked repeatedly. We had to submit our comments by August 22nd, but we have no idea when they're going to publish their final minimum guidance. At least we haven't, they just say soon.
Yeah, my understanding is that the funding has been released at least for FY22, but I know Montana's in this position that we are trying to draft an RFP plan for the first year projects, but we are waiting on that the final rules and guidance, because there's a lot of holes to fill in RFP because we don't know what the minimum requirements are going to be.
Yeah, I'd like to also flag that they just closed the Build America, Buy America comments period on September 30th. And those cover EV chargers and cover construction materials. And while there are currently a proposed waiver through the end of this calendar year for the, if their proposals take effect, they will start for the charging equipment in calendar year 2023, but to be phased in, but the construction materials waiver goes away in January 2023. So there are a lot of, it's not clear if transformers, if conduit, if all that is going to be required to be made in America. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and we really are going to have a tough time going forward until all that guidance is published.
Hey, Thomas, I see you have a hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. These were great presentations. Thank you all for giving these presentations. It's great to see the map of the whole Northwest. Since we have lots of utility people on the call here, and that first poll that you put out, Connor, showed that about 10% of people on the call feel ready for these fast chargers. I wanted to ask the utilities their thoughts about make ready. They saw, we all saw the maps of where the alternative fuel corridors are, where these charging stations are going to go. And I'm wondering from the utility perspective, maybe some of you who know that you're going to have some of these NEVI fast charging sites in your territory, what your thoughts are on being prepared for 600 kilowatts of power supply, or maybe more in Oregon if you've got these 350 kilowatt chargers. So I'm not sure who in the utility realm out there might want to address this, but I bet there's someone. Or we'll start calling on people. Or maybe utilities that have already done this. I think if Juan is on the line, Juan, do you have a site like this in eWeb's territory already? Is Juan still with us? Maybe not.
Thomas, this is Patty from Idaho Power. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll jump in. So if I understand the question, is the utility ready for sites this size?
Yes, and sort of what the considerations are for this amount of power, going to those sites, and also as a follow-on, which might be for the presenters, can NEVI funding cover transformer upgrades if that's required for a high-speed charging site?
So I think the short answer is utilities can provide power almost anywhere. It's just at what cost. So getting with the utility early in the process and continuous conversation with utility will be important. A couple things to note are, I could tell you there is a capacity at a specific site today. That might not be true 2 months from now. If another customer comes in and takes that capacity before a project, really moves forward, that is something to consider. But I think, utilities are aware of this. We have very robust planning processes and are constantly looking at how we're going to meet future load, and it's definitely on our radar. So I guess short answer is, yeah, we'll be able to provide it, but at what cost? And I think, communication with utilities will be key.
So Nicholas Garcia here with the Washington Public Utility District Association. I'm not with any particular utility, but I can give you kind of an overview. And I would agree with what I believe Patty was, who just said that part of the challenge is that if you have a infrastructure available, you have to site where the capacity exists. So we have two issues: distribution, does that have the capacity? And it may be as simple as moving a site from 200 yards or 400 yards to a different spot, and it would make a significant difference on the effort that's required and the cost that's required in order to serve such a load. And then there's just the general question of, do you have the generation or capacity to handle a load? And that gets back to a different sort of question. One of the things that we struggle a little bit with is the question of time. If at different times in the day there's a bigger demand on the grid than at other times, and making sure that you have the capacity at the time the customer wants to charge the vehicle is something that's really important, which may result in the need to have time of use rates to reflect the fact that different times of the day you have different challenges to support the load, and all these things add complication to the consumer. And I realize that, but it's a challenge for utilities because the costs that utilities face are not stagnant and really depend upon the decisions that people might make with regard to where to site the facilities and what sort of capacity they want to include for those sites. So happy to answer any questions if you have it.
That's excellent. I guess I'd also like to ask the presenters if NEVI funds can cover some of the utility side upgrades, like transformers, for example. And one more just add-on question, which is, availability of equipment, especially when this money cannon of federal government money is coming, nationwide. All the utilities know that availability of transformers can be 50 to 100 weeks out. And I think the same, I've heard problems also on sourcing chargers, or maybe there just aren't enough DC fast chargers in the pipeline yet to supply all the states. So I'm wondering about thoughts on that and how that might affect the rollout of fast charging sites.
So this is Tonya Buell with Washington State, and I can address the first question, which is about may NEVI funds be used for electrical upgrades and transformers? And we will know for sure when the requirements and standards come out from FHWA and the Joint Office. In the original guidelines, that was one of the things that Washington State asked when we had our state meeting with the Joint Office, and they said, no, you can't use the funding for transformers. And we fought for that. And then when they came out with the frequently asked questions, they said, yes, you can use those funds for transformers and things. But we still need to wait for the final guidance to know for sure. In any event, the NEVI funds, even though it sounds like a lot, 200 million for our 4 states, we want to put as much infrastructure in the ground as possible. So if there are other funding sources that are available from national funds for these types of projects, we would prefer, I think, having using other funding for major grid upgrades. So it's to be determined, and I think it may be up to the states on how they want to invest their funds. Personally, I think it's all part of the project. It's not just the actual charging equipment, it's everything from the grid as well, but that's to be determined.
And this is Kyla, just to really quickly add, I think exactly kind of what Tonya said, but in Montana, we are considering, covering some of the costs, looking at other funding sources too, to spread our limited dollars further to do more projects. So that is the trade-off. We do want to try to do as many projects, but we also want, projects in rural areas where, these costs may be higher. So that's a consideration. Just a note that we will also be looking at ways to evaluate and compare the costs of doing battery storage at some of the locations instead of some of those upgrades. If that is a viable alternative, and cost comparing that at specific locations, not of course for every location, because storage is also can be it can cost quite a bit of additional dollars on a per project per kilowatt basis. So we're looking at that as a potential alternative, that we're open to that for eligible aspects of the project.
Thank you. Wendellin's had her hand up there for a while, so I want to give you a chance to chime in.
Thank you so much, Connor, and hello to everyone. Hello to my colleagues in Idaho. I don't work for the state. I'm former Fed, though. I'm lucky enough to serve on our governor's task force for the implementation of all this stuff. And I'm in DC right now, just came off several days of the Tribal Energy Summit, where on the NEVI presentations that happened, there were several, pretty much across the board, the tribes or their lobbyists, their other representatives, indicated that they hadn't really been included in meaningful consultation, even if they had been contacted initially, maybe attended a meeting or something, that pretty much across the board, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, I'm just sort of saying collectively, we as a nation, those of us on the call here who are non-natives and are running this stuff, if you think maybe you've already checked the box for stakeholder engagement with Native populations, I'd just like to suggest going perhaps one step further, rather than including tribes just as another stakeholder, like another community or another industry, but to really think of them as sovereigns, even if only because at this particular juncture, they are getting their own buckets, plural, of funding for this EV infrastructure. And I think they could really benefit from these kind of planning conversations that are going on. And they'll have their own funds to work on this, but so many of these corridors go through their lands or skip over their lands, and perhaps and I apologize if there are native representatives on the call here, and I'm speaking out of turn. But one organization that perhaps might be helpful to kind of serve as a point for these discussions might be ATNI, the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. That might be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent point. And if I could just add that you're right, we probably have not done enough outreach with the Washington State Plan. We are planning consumer engagement and outreach over the entirety of the program. So we rushed and did a bunch of outreach this summer, trying to reach as many of the stakeholders listed in the planning documents. However, we are specifically, we've on October 12th, we have a meeting with the Tribal Transportation Planning Organization in Spokane. And I'm thinking maybe Idaho wants to come check that out as well. That might be helpful. I think we really need to work as a region on these things. And yeah, we have more to do, and appreciate your feedback.
Thanks, Sonia.
And another question came in the chat I wanted to get to. Some of the speakers, I know Mary, you touched on this specifically, but are any of the states placing a reliability requirement for grant recipients? Seems to be an ongoing issue over the high percentage of public chargers being out of service. Definitely something I've noticed, probably all of us have noticed. So if anyone could touch more specifically on any requirements, there would be great.
Well, in Washington State, this is something that we're placing a high priority on reliable charging. So in our RFP process, we are going to be looking for potential vendors and contractors that have had proof that their stations have been up and operating, and that they've got a good track record. And then we do plan, the great thing about the federal funds is they do not expire. So unlike our state funds that expire every 2 years, with the federal funds, we can hold back a percentage of funds till the end of the project that could be contingent upon meeting reliability goals. And a lot of the EVSE providers brag that they have 97% uptime, for example. But all that means is that there's power to the charger. It doesn't mean that someone can drive up and access the station, that they can make a payment, that they can start the charging and get a full charge, and get what they expect when they come to a station. So we haven't figured out exactly what the carrots and sticks are going to be, but we've seen over the years with EVSE providers coming in and out of the market in mergers and different things, that some are more reliable than others. But when you have someone that needs a charger and it's not available, that can really hurt the reputation of the whole program, because of the bad publicity it would get. So I think everyone should be concerned about reliability. I see Mary popped in. I'm sure she shares this concern.
Absolutely. But I wanted to say, I like that you are starting, and we all should, to diagnose what does it mean to be reliable, because what an EVSP, electric vehicle service provider, might say is reliability is not what you and I would experience when we pull up. And so there is, if you pull into a bank of, they say 97% per port is what the federal minimum standards are, but we want to have a charging station maybe meet a 99%. So at least one charger has to almost always be available. That's one thing that we're considering doing. Carrots and sticks, like Tonya suggested, withholding some funding till the end. Again, if like the entire electrical system goes down in an area, you can't hold the charging company. They're not responsible for that. But we need to plan for that as well. And so we need to start thinking about microgrids and solar backup and battery storage backup and that sort of thing as well. But the other thing that Tonya mentioned that I absolutely agree with is payment access. So I have myself pulled up, Electrify America has a great reputation for all types of things, but the charging station nearest me that I go to all the time keeps saying, credit card reader down, have to use the app. Well, the entire point of the federal minimum standards payment mechanisms guidance is that you shouldn't have to go to an app to do anything. And I'm not saying, Electrify America is not doing that when they're meeting NEVI standards, I suspect. But it is frustrating if you don't have, if you don't have an app, if you don't have your cell phone all loaded up, if you don't have good cell phone access, and you're stuck there. So it's hard if the payment mechanisms also aren't available. So there's a lot of different aspects of, I just heard about someone with, some of the charging stations are now including, in addition to a CCS or a CHAdeMO port, they're including like a Tesla proprietary port, and that one didn't work. That one didn't go in. So that's a problem, so if some of these new proprietary, Tesla proprietary ports, or if your additional CHAdeMO one doesn't work either, it's just, there's lots of things that could go wrong, and it's just not acceptable. We are not going to electrify transportation with this, with the perception, which is, at least in Oregon right now, most of what I hear is that, you're lucky if you can find a charging station, and you're even luckier if it works when you get there. So that's bad. We have a ways to go.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I want to recognize that we were right at our scheduled time. So I wanted to thank the presenters and attendees, and hand it over to Thomas for our final goodbye here.
Great, thanks, Connor. And yeah, thanks again to Kyla and Emily and Tonya and Mary. These really informative presentations. The purpose of this forum is to have this kind of information, and also the connection and the resources, knowing who we can talk to and what programs exist out there. With that, we will have our next roundtable in January. So look forward to that after, probably we'll announce before Christmas. And thank you all for attending. And as always, BEF is here as a resource. Fourth is here as a resource. And if you ever have questions or thoughts, please reach out to us. Everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Will we be receiving copies of the slides?
Yes, there
and
is.
Will all the members be receiving copies of the slides?
Yes. Everyone who attended the meeting today, we have your email address from the registration, and Fourth will send out an email that includes the slides, and I believe also the recording of the session today.